So one of the categories that I think Apple used to be really good at, and they just don't do it anymore, and I really wish they did, was compact laptops. And I don't mean things like the 14-inch MacBook Pro or the 13-inch MacBook Air like what we have today. I'm talking about things like the PowerBook G4 12-inch, which is my favorite laptop that they ever made, or the subject of today's video, which is my favorite variant of the MacBook Air, the 11-inch MacBook Air. This is the 2015 model. This is actually the last year they made these types, and we're going to talk about what it's like to use it in 2024. So let's dive in. So first things first, there's two reasons why I wanted to make this video. And the first reason is because this thing was a steal. I got this thing for $130, even though it's a 2015 model. So it's a bit older, but it's not officially supported by macOS and can still be forced to run the latest version of macOS, which is Sonoma. We'll talk more about what that's like here in a bit. But the other reason why I wanted to do this is because there are no Macs officially running the latest version of macOS that are smaller than 13 inches. The smallest one you can get is the M3 MacBook Air, which is a 13-inch laptop. And I feel like people still want compact Macs, like an 11-inch variant, that can run the latest version of macOS. But as of right now, if you want a smaller screen than the MacBook Air, you have to go with an iPad. And while iPads have gotten apps that make them slightly closer to a laptop replacement, and Stage Manager does give you a bit more of that macOS feel, there's still not quite a replacement on the iPad for just macOS on a compact screen. And so that's kind of the focus of this video, is mainly talking about how this thing is as a macOS device at its size in the modern day. So now that we know why I want to make this video, let's talk about what this MacBook Air is. And this is, like I said, an 11-inch model from 2015, early 2015, the last year that they made this variant. This model is upgraded in one way, the way that I'm actually really glad it's upgraded, and everything else is the base configuration. Starting off with the processor, this is one of the two things in this machine that are still the base configuration. You have a Core i5 5250U running at 1.6 gigahertz. It's a dual-core Broadwell chip with hyper-threading, and it's okay. Again, it's a base configuration for this machine, but for web browsing, emails, documents, it's totally fine. And because it's an i5, the cooling is pretty good. You don't hear the fans on this too frequently, and the battery life is roughly what Apple claimed it was back in the day, which was about 9 hours, though we'll dive more into that a little later. The other base piece in this machine is the storage, which is 128 gigabytes of storage. It's fine. macOS can kind of manage itself on 128 gigs because, well, up until recently, you could still get devices with 128 gigs on newer Macs, so yeah, I guess that's kind of okay. But with a little $10 adapter off of Amazon, you can throw a standard NVMe drive into this thing and have way more storage, which I do intend to do. But for now, we have Apple's kind of proprietary, not proprietary NVMe, which is still a serviceable part. So that's a plus. The one component on this that was upgraded from base, which I'm really glad it was the RAM, because the base RAM on this was 4 gigabytes back in the day. And this has 8 gigabytes of RAM, and it's soldered down just like every other Mac, so if I had 4, I was stuck with it. I have 8, I'm still stuck with it, but it's better than 4. And considering that there are Macs today that still ship with 8 gigabytes of RAM, like the current MacBook Air and the current Mac Mini, macOS, even if it's Sonoma and it's unofficial on this thing, it knows how to handle 8 gigabytes of RAM just fine. One of the other benefits to this being a later generation MacBook Air is that you have full USB 3, which I know sounds kind of like a standard thing nowadays, but I've used older MacBooks in the modern day, like the 2008 MacBook, and those have USB 2, and even earlier generations of this only had USB 2, so having USB 3 is kind of a must. But the other benefit is that it has Thunderbolt 2, which was the first big upgrade to Thunderbolt, going from 10 gigabits to 20 gigabits per second. And so you have a lot of different accessories that just work with Thunderbolt. I personally used a Blackmagic Intensity capture card, which uses Thunderbolt, and despite this thing only having an i5, it captured footage just fine. And I was also really looking into getting one of those 1440p Apple Thunderbolt displays, because you can just plug this in, it charges it because it has MagSafe on one side and Thunderbolt on the other, and you can just have a 1440p display with a hub on the back, and it puts out from this laptop. Like, I'm probably not going to do that for a while, but the fact that those are just accessories you can have for this is pretty cool. I did mention MagSafe as well, and God, I miss MagSafe. I'm glad they brought it back in the later generations, because my last modern Mac laptop was kind of in the dark period where it was all USB-C, no MagSafe, and God, I've just missed it. It's the best charging port I have ever seen. Even Microsoft ripped it off with the Surface, so you cannot tell me that Apple did not knock it out of the park with MagSafe. It is the best connector. I'm glad they brought it back. They never should have gotten rid of it, and more companies need to do it. Like, it's just so good. The only other port on this is a headphone jack, which, you know, it's a headphone jack. You can't really take it for granted nowadays, but it is there. And the one thing that this is lacking that the 13-inch variant did have was an SD card reader. So that does kind of suck, but if you want to load things onto this, you just plug in a USB to SD adapter and, well, there you go. Inside the laptop, there is one thing that I will always praise, no matter which laptop it is. If it's from this generation of laptops, I will always praise it, and that is the keyboard. It is the best keyboard that Apple has ever put on a laptop. Even modern laptops from Apple still haven't quite reached this level. The new ones are better, much better than butterfly keys, but every time I type on this, I feel like I can type so much faster on this than any other laptop I've used. It is so good. And one of the cool things they did with this laptop's keyboard is they shrunk the function keys, which seems kind of weird, but the reason they did that was so that you still had a good-sized trackpad and a decent amount of palm space, and all of the keys except the function keys are full-size. So you get a full-size keyboard minus the function keys and a full-size trackpad with a good palm rest space. That is so good. The attention to detail is just, I miss that about this generation of laptops compared to the new stuff. Below the keyboard, like I said, is a full-size trackpad for this era of Apple. It's obviously not as big as the modern Mac trackpads, but it's still pretty big, and it's bigger than what you get on the iPad with the keyboard case, so I like using it. It still feels great, especially since it's a glass trackpad, and overall, the interface experience, plugs, keyboard, trackpad, all of that is so nice to use, despite this device's more than compact size. The one thing, of course, that didn't age well, and this probably isn't going to surprise anybody, is the display. Now, it is better than the display from the 13-inch model I reviewed a few years back. You can check that out over there. I don't know if they changed the panel or what, but the viewing angles are a little bit better than what I was seeing on that model, but it's still not the best display. If it was a higher resolution display at this size, it would be perfect, and these bezels are just... whew. Inside these bezels, the display resolution is 1366 by 768. It's a 16 by 9 display, and I feel like this device would have really benefited from a 16 by 10 or even a 4 by 3 display, just so you had a little bit more verticality with the screen. And especially with this model, the 2015, towards the end of its life, that lower resolution was really starting to show its age. Although one little detail that I do like when it comes to the display, specifically the bezels, because this is the era where Apple really paid attention to every little detail, was the fact that there's no visible power indicator for the webcam. But when you turn the webcam on, you can see an indicator light, because Apple cut the tiniest little holes over top of that LED so that when it's on, you can see it, but when it's off, it just vanishes into the bezel. That is such a minor thing, but I love it because it just shows that they cared. Although, speaking of the webcam,
there's really only two things I can say about the webcam that are positive. One of them is the fact that it has a webcam, and the second thing is that it's 720p on this version, whereas the original launch model was 640 by 480. Aside from that, it is very grainy, even in the best of lighting conditions, as you can see. Even though it's protected by an entirely metal bezel, it still smears for some reason, and I've wiped this lens off multiple times. The microphones, while they are upgraded to be slightly better at noise canceling than the previous generation, also don't do this any favors when it comes to video calling, but on the same hand, all the video calls that I've done for my other job have just about the same video quality on a Microsoft Surface, so maybe it's not as bad, and I just prefer to have a better webcam like the ones I use externally on my desktops, but generally, Zoom calls are okay, but don't go using this for full video recording. Just my thoughts.
Yeah, even by 2015 standards, this webcam was kind of starting to show its age, and by today's standards, it is awful. And I know some laptops still ship with this, but honestly, even though it's off-center, you're still better off going with the front-facing camera on an iPad. Like, I actually have not used the webcam on this thing for anything more than testing and recording that little bit you saw. Like, this webcam is probably the weakest link on this laptop. So by 2015 standards, this laptop for the price, which at the time was $900, was actually pretty good aside from the webcam, but I think by today's standards, a couple things really haven't aged too well, like the display and of course the webcam. But the keyboard, the ports, the actual performance, which we'll dive a bit more into here in a minute, have all actually been pretty solid. Which is surprising because I've been forcing this thing to run macOS Sonoma instead of the last officially supported version of macOS, which was Monterey. The software I used to make this happen was called OpenCore Legacy Patcher. Basically, it lets you run the latest versions of macOS on unsupported hardware. And you can do some pretty extreme installs, like I got Sonoma to run on a 2009 MacBook, but it wasn't super happy. Considering this one doesn't really have a lot of difference between one of the later supported Intel Macs and itself, this thing actually ran flawlessly. And I actually got to keep quite a few features that I was expecting to lose or just to not have work. One of the features I found really cool, because I didn't realize this could do it, was unlock with Apple Watch. So I can just open the lid and it unlocks it with my Apple Watch. That was really cool. Metal is still fully supported on this thing, at least unofficially fully supported. So all the wallpapers that require metal still work. Metal acceleration does pretty well. And when it comes to things like running compressor, which I've used here and there on this, it does use metal acceleration with the Intel integrated graphics and works just fine. But all those things are kind of niche or really not as important. Like, cool, you can open up your laptop and it unlocks with your watch, and yeah, okay, it runs compressor, but who's really doing that? What is it like if I am just using it as a laptop the way it was intended back when it came out in 2015? Pretty damn good. When I was using this thing as a replacement for my iPad Pro, I actually really didn't notice much of a difference from my day-to-day usage. Sure, certain programs didn't open quite as fast, but I could browse the web at regular speed because that more relies on internet speed than it does on processor speed. I could type all my documents just like I did before. It's still running modern macOS, so all my iCloud data synced. The biggest limit for me when it came to saving stuff was the storage, but I'm going to upgrade that later, so that won't be an issue. I did try some photo editing on this thing, and this again came down to a limitation with the display because it's not a great display and definitely not as color accurate as the iPad display, but it still opened and edited them. I just didn't have the color accuracy I wanted. Funnily enough, I did find myself reaching out to touch the display to do things like take YouTube videos out of full screen because I'm so used to doing that with my iPad, and well, I used this instead of my iPad, so that did kind of throw me off here and there, but it was also because, well, performance-wise, it didn't feel any different. I was genuinely impressed. I think for me personally, if I had the choice between a $130 or $150 Windows machine, $130 or $150 Chromebook, or this, I would actually probably choose this because you have basically the same I/O, albeit a better charger and a not as relevant port for Thunderbolt. But while the display isn't as good, you're going to have a much better keyboard. The software surprisingly runs very, very good, even though this hardware is technically no longer supported. And the battery life. Like, the battery life on a Chromebook is going to be really good. The battery life on a $150 Windows machine is probably not going to be so good. And the battery life on this thing, I would get basically what Apple claimed you would get from this back when it was new, roughly 9 hours. Like, I kid you not, as recently as yesterday, I took this thing over to my parents' house while I was visiting, and I didn't bring the charger with me. That's how confident I was in the battery life. And that kind of comes down to the fact that macOS is still very, very well optimized, even if it wasn't specifically optimized for this chip. And the chip itself really isn't that powerful, so it's not pulling a lot of power. And, of course, the battery on this thing is pretty substantial. So all those things combined meant that I could get, again, roughly what Apple claimed, 9 hours, full stop. I mean, honestly, for an 8-year-old computer, I was more surprised at how few things it couldn't do. Like, yeah, it can't render videos very quickly, but it wasn't really intended for that even when it was brand new. And yeah, you can't play 4K video out of it very easily, but it doesn't have a 4K display, and it barely supports a 4K external display anyway. Everything else that it was intended for, like web browsing, watching YouTube videos at the display resolution, or typing up documents, sending emails, all that kind of stuff, it still does it perfectly. And like, I'm sure there's some Windows folks out there saying, oh, 8 years old isn't even that old. And I get it. I know you probably have some Windows 95 machine that you're forcing to run Windows 10, but the way it used to be with macOS, when Apple would drop support for a Mac, it was usually because some key features for the new version of macOS just would not run on older hardware. And so they would drop the Macs that feature just wouldn't run on. But in this case, there really isn't anything that I threw at this on the newer version of macOS that it just didn't take like a champ. So color me impressed. For me personally, I'm actually going to keep using this MacBook, not as a daily driver. I'm going to leave that to my iPad Pro for portable stuff. But I do a lot of stuff with my cars, including tuning my cars, doing data logs when I take them to the track and things like that. And the tools I use can run on this. So I'm going to keep using this basically as a trackside tuning tool for my cars. That is how useful this thing still is in 2024. So if you get the opportunity to get yourself a 2015 MacBook Air, whether it be the 11 or the 13 inch, because at that point the only variance is the display size, I would hop on it if it's anything close to 130 or less. Honestly, I would have paid 200 for this thing and still been happy. Either way, color me impressed. I am actually kind of disappointed that Apple dropped support for these. And for anybody out there who still really wants a small MacBook that runs the latest version of macOS, even if it's unofficially, get yourself one of these. They are so, so good, even in the modern day. Hopefully you found this video helpful. I actually have a lot of things planned for using some older Macs in the modern day. You all voted for it, and the next one's gonna be a trash can Mac Pro, so whew, wish me luck on that one. Until then, thank you all so much for watching this video. Let me know your thoughts down in the comments below. I really want to see them. I want to know what you all think about this because this was a blast using this and I can't wait to keep using this laptop. Either way, comments below, like and subscribe if you enjoy this kind of content because I got a lot more planned. And until then, thank you all so much for watching and I'll see you in the next video. Make sure to be there and have a good one.